Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to thank you all for being here a little bit early and for filling out this poll so we can see who's attending. We're really excited to see everyone on the call today, and we'll be getting started in just a couple minutes. Well, why don't I talk for a minute while people are finishing up the poll. Again, welcome to everyone who's here today. We're really excited for this first webinar in our series on autism and community. We'll have 5 webinars focusing on different topics, and today we're talking about education. So it looks like the people that are on our webinar today represent a wide variety of backgrounds. We've got advocates for people with disability and some agency staff. We have some teachers and researchers, so welcome to everyone. My name is Rebecca Lazo. I work for the Institute for Community Inclusion, obviously, on the Think College project. We're hosting these discussions as part of our 50th anniversary celebration because we're excited to be committed to expanding the discussion around autism and developmental and intellectual disabilities. Before we get started, I want to let you know a little bit about Zoom. I'm going to end this poll because I'm not sure if everyone is if it's in the middle of everyone's screen or not, but there we go. For anyone that's new to Zoom or has some questions about how to get around, I made this little diagram for you. We want to make sure this black bar is available and you can navigate whether you are seeing a chat box and muted and things like that. Actually, I think everyone's muted. And you want to make sure if you're putting in a question for the for our staff here at ICI, that you include all panelists and attendees so that your question goes to the whole group and not just, sometimes it can go to just one individual. So you want to make sure that that blue pull down box is all panelists and attendees. And if you have any questions about how to use Zoom or questions for the panelists throughout the presentation, we invite you to put those in the chat box. We do have several people that are monitoring the chat box and will be trying to answer your questions about technology issues as we go. Questions for panelists or presenters, we will hold them till the end. We've left some time at the end of our presentation to address questions from the community as a whole, and the panelists will be ready to answer those questions. Before we get started with the panel, I wanted to note that in the disability community, there's not consensus about best terms for talking about people on the autism spectrum. So you may hear different language today, like autistic people or people with autism, people on the spectrum. And for this series, it's fine to use whichever of those terms you prefer. That goes for our presenters and for anyone posting questions in the chat pod. I'm going to introduce Tom Santacandro now. He's the director of the Institute for Community Inclusion. He'll be moderating today's discussion. Since this is the first event in the series, Tom's going to share a little bit about how and why we decided to launch this series. So Tom? You're muted, Tom.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank my panelists and everyone who's on the line today for coming out and being with us today to talk about these very important subjects. Especially, I want to thank the team at ICI and Rebecca for heading this up. There's a lot of work that goes into this process that you can imagine, and we are all spread across the country as we do this, which is kind of an exciting thing that's happening. First off, this is a series that's part of our 50th anniversary celebration of the Institute for Community Inclusion. And we thought a good way to celebrate would be to have an educational speaker series that would be informative, as well as to showcase the expertise that we have at the ICI. This series will be a chance for us to get beyond common stereotypes around autism and to open up to a much richer conversation. Today, our panelists will be discussing issues around education and autism. And now back to Rebecca to introduce today's panelists.
Thanks, Tom. Oh, am I muted? No. So with us today, we have Stephen Shore, who's a clinical assistant professor at Adelphi University. He has an EDD in special education and is a nationally regarded scholar around autism, as well as being on the spectrum himself. We have Julia Landau, who is director of the Autism Center at the Massachusetts Advocates for Children, or Mass Advocates, I think people call it in the area. She's a specialist in special education law and provides workshops for parents and professionals. We also have Ned Pavlik. I hope I'm saying your name correctly, Ned. I didn't check that with you beforehand. He's a student at Holyoke Community College. Ned is also on the autism spectrum, and he'll be sharing some of his experiences and thoughts about education and disability. We also have Maria Paiewonsky, who's transition specialist at ICI. She's an expert on involving young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in research about their college experiences. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. Julia, we need to make sure you're on camera. I don't see you on camera at the moment. But otherwise, it looks like we're good to go. So Tom, if you want to get started, that's great.
Great. I am ready to go. And panelists, welcome. I'm glad you're here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask some questions and then ask each of you to weigh in. What I'm going to do initially, at least, is to call on you directly just to keep things flowing more smoothly, since sometimes it can be a challenge for us to figure out who should be talking and who shouldn't at this point. So I'm going to start with the questions. The other thing is, don't feel obligated to answer or to respond to any of these. And then on the other hand, you may feel like you really want to get pretty involved with some of these questions as they come out. So feel free to do that. We are going to try to keep on a reasonably tight schedule here. We're going to continue with this question and answer period until about 2:50, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So the first question that I want you to think about is, let's talk about a bit about some of the myths and facts regarding students on the spectrum. What's an example of a common belief about students on the spectrum that's just not accurate? And then what's the reality? Stephen, would you like to start out on that? Oh, you got to unmute Stephen.
Oh, there we go.
Great.
As an autistic individual who was a student and also who have students with autism in my classes, there's so many myths out there. And one of them is that all people on the autism spectrum are visually oriented. And I think the best way to look at learning styles is that those of us autistic individuals, we are probably visually oriented. It isn't necessarily so. But what we can say is, whatever that learning style is, it's probably going to be to an extreme.
Great. Julia, would you like to? Yep, everyone has to unmute, I guess, since we are, I don't know, maybe we can unmute all the panelists at this point, make it a little.
Sorry about that. I think that's one of the most largest overarching myths, I think, is just these assumptions that often get created about the lowered potential or lower competency about people with autism. You know, when people see the different modes of communication or different behaviors, there's just assumptions made about the lack of competency all too often. And I just want to give a couple of examples of what we see time and time again, where we end up having to represent families and students and have legal cases because of these assumptions. We have a lot of families who really want to focus on more inclusive options for their kids who have autism. And sometimes a district will believe that a child needs to be segregated in a pull-out setting because the child is too distracted. And this assumption is based on a myth, I think, that because a child isn't looking at the teacher and establishing eye contact, that the child isn't paying attention and isn't learning. So then we've had to get experts and argue and demonstrate through the legal process that even though the child may not be looking at the teacher, it doesn't mean that there's a lack of attention, and show that the child, you know, in many cases is listening and learning, as you can see in the academic progress. So that's one example. Another example that we see time and time again is these lowered expectations if the individual is nonverbal or has limited oral speech. And again, there just can be assumptions made that because the child isn't communicating verbally, that they don't have the potential to learn or to be successful. And so it becomes, you know, often the parents might see that even though the school believes the child can't learn to read, the parent might see the child at home, sitting with their siblings, picking up books, tracking words with their fingers, and really then advocating for different kinds of augmentative alternative communication devices so that the child can really learn, you know, to their potential. So those are just a few examples.
Great, thank you. Ned, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Hold on. For me, I have two common myths. One of them is that some kids, they use their disability as an excuse of, like, say some things they're not doing well, and in reality they may not have all the supports, or like they've maybe strung each support out to the point where something maybe just isn't clicking. For a second myth, I've heard some people say that autistic kids shouldn't be in school. You know, they maybe because of their disability, it's hard for them to concentrate or be able to do things just like a normal kid, which I feel like that's kind of not true. Where in reality, if they find the right supports and maybe find friends that can relate to them, to what they're going through, they can go to school just like anybody else.
Maria?
Yeah, and I'm just going to tap into a little bit of what Ned was saying. Excuse me, I'm just going to move myself over here a little bit because Ned and I were talking about this yesterday. Ned and I do a lot of work around college access, and I said, do you mean that people have doubted that young people on the autism spectrum can go to college? And they said, yes, but I've also experienced that in high school too. So I guess you mean both, Ned, right? Yeah. And I would say, to add to that, a myth that I think often, because I do a lot of work around training people to do transition work, is that individuals with autism need a lot of specialized supports. And I hear that from the college end, and I hear that from the high school end. And I think that really that's kind of a myth, because although they might need some specialized supports, I think what they really benefit from is what all young adults and adolescents need, is early and ongoing support and planning, and the ability to change your mind and start over again, and that they've got a team of people supporting them, no matter who they are. So that would be the myth that I would contribute.
Great, great. Thank you, everyone. The next question is, people on the spectrum and their friends and allies often do a lot of powerful advocacy. And I'd like to see if you could describe a time when you advocated for yourself or for someone on the spectrum, or when you observed someone on the spectrum advocating for themselves. What was the situation? How did it play out? And what was the result? Who'd like to start on that one? Julia, do you have you ready to weigh in on that one?
People hearing me okay, or should I keep?
Yes, nope, you're good.
Okay. Well, at the Autism Center, we do a lot of advocacy for individual students, and we also do a lot of legislative advocacy. And I think what we've seen demonstrated time and time again is the strength and the efficacy of having self-advocates, individuals with autism involved in all the different kinds of legal advocacy and legal workshops and trainings that we're doing. So when we're advocating with policymakers and lawmakers, when we have young adults with autism testify based on their own expertise and their own personal experience, it is unbelievably powerful and persuasive. And when we have some of our fellows who have autism participate in IEP meetings or co-present when we're training educators or parents, again, it's just very powerful and very impactful. One more specific example is from our Autism Center's helpline. Years ago, we were getting more and more calls from parents who were concerned about the bullying that their kids were experiencing in the public schools. And so we mobilized with a lot of our sister organizations to try and document the extent of bullying that was occurring, because we knew anecdotally that students who had autism were being bullied at higher rates, but we really wanted to get a sense of what the breadth of the problems were. So we conducted a statewide survey, and individuals from around the state, documented what their experiences were. And then that mobilized self-advocates and parents and advocates to mobilize at the State House, and the legislature enacted an anti-bullying law that had very specific protections for students with autism. Now, there's still a long way to go until that law is fully and effectively implemented. So having self-advocates as co-trainers as we train about bullying and anti-bullying strategies, it's really important, we found, to have individuals with autism involved as much as possible.
Great. Ned, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Due to my life circumstance, I've had to move a lot of times in regards of living with families in different environments where my family kept arguing and stuff like that, where I had to advocate and find different people who would at least be a temporary place until I'm currently where I'm at now, where I don't have to worry about being in a different bad environment. So that's basically where my advocating has been.
Great, thank you. Maria?
I guess I'm going to share a story. This is a story that comes actually from this part of the state in Western Massachusetts. I do a lot of inclusive research. So I'm doing research with young people with autism and also individuals with intellectual disabilities. But I was working with a young woman with autism, and I heard this great story about how she was going to college because she wanted to be a better writer, and she was accustomed to writing fairy tales, but she knew that in college she might be able to learn how to write better. And she was also interested in mythology. So her advisor selected a class and said, you're going to have to talk to the professor about getting into the class. And she told the professor that she was very interested in taking this mythology class, and he made an assumption about her abilities to read and to understand mythology. And he said, just as an example, this is the textbook that we use in this class. And she said, yes, I know. I have a book at home and I've read it all. So I think I belong in this class. And so I just see that as a really nice example of somebody advocating and persevering when she could see the low expectations.
Great. Thank you. Stephen?
Yes, I have a story that also comes from Western Massachusetts. I was helping a friend on the autism spectrum to advocate for herself to the student support office at one of the community colleges in Western Massachusetts. So we went in there with a plan to describe what challenges my friend faced in education in terms of what needs she needed for accommodations. And I was very pleased because she did very well. She described what her needs were, and the response from the counselor at the disabilities office was even more encouraging. And the response was, well, I don't know that much about autism, so please teach me. So I think that was very, very encouraging on all sides.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
The next question is, what's the biggest change that you've seen happen in terms of including students on the spectrum in classrooms? And in addition to that, what additional changes or other changes do you think need to occur to include students with autism? in education. We'll start with Maria.
Okay. Well, one of the things I do an awful lot of work with transition and inclusive dual enrollment. So I have to say that.
Can you just describe what, to folks that may not understand or may
Okay.
not have heard the term dual inclusive enrollment, what that is?
Yes, of course. I'm sorry. So that's an opportunity that for transition age students that are between the ages of 18 and 22 and may absolutely are still eligible for transition services, but have already completed 4 years of school. There is now a new trend, you know, here in Massachusetts for quite a while now, but also through the higher ed opportunity to get an opportunity to include policies inclusive in transition services, which is so exciting. And
I'm not
more
sure.
students on the opportunity.
I think you're breaking up, and I'm not sure if the other panelists can tell me whether that's maybe.
Yeah, Julia's breaking up from this end too.
Okay. Why don't we, that's all right, hold on. It's a great story that we need to hear. Why don't we transition to Stephen, if you want to weigh in now, since your connection is clearer at this point.
Okay, sure. Finding that more and more educators are aware of autism, and that's really good. You know, aware of autism when there is a child on the spectrum in their class, and they're learning more about what needs to be done. So that's encouraging as well. What I think needs to be, what we need more of, is more support for educators in the schools, both in grade school education and higher education. Because what I find is that teachers at all levels are thirsting for information on how to support their students on the autism spectrum. And what they're finding, and I find as well, is that an educator who can teach a student with autism and come up with strategies is often a better educator all around.
Great. Julia?
Sure. I'll kind of pick up from where Maria was headed, because I would say that one of the biggest changes I've also seen is the inclusion of individuals with autism and intellectual disabilities in higher ed. And so what Maria was beginning to talk about is that there are, in Massachusetts and in many other parts of the country, there's new initiatives so that students who are still in special ed and still have IEPs and are in the 18 to 22-year-old age range are now fully included in college courses and in the life of the campus, and really demonstrating that untapped potential that we talked about before, how these students are learning they're auditing classes for the most part, they're learning really to their potential, they're learning to take public transportation, they're learning to navigate the campus, they're really learning the skills that they need to live and work as independently as possible in the community. And it's a partnership, that's the dual enrollment piece, between the school district and the special ed department, as well as the higher ed system. And as Stephen has talked about, it's really important, especially when these initiatives are being launched, to make sure that the educators really have the kind of support they need to know how to address the needs of individuals with autism. But a lot of the strategies are really strategies that make the faculty, the professors, the special ed educators, better educators for everybody. And that's really what a lot of the professors talk about in higher ed after they've had the experience of including individuals who may not be awarded a regular high school diploma at the end of their special ed involvement in the school district, but still can greatly benefit from the benefits of higher ed. And then in terms of other changes that need to occur, what we see kind of at the same time is that as school districts are struggling in some cases to meet the complex communication and behavioral and social needs of kids with autism, there can be a tendency to provide the specialized services that kids need, whether it's behavioral therapies or speech and language, communication skills or social skills, and pull out separate settings, which sometimes may be what kids need, but a lot of times we've been able to see that when those services are infused within the general ed setting, the kids can continue to learn with their non-disabled peers and still get the kind of specialized instruction that they need. So I think there's, like with everything, there's still more changes that need to occur and a lot of progress at the same time.
Let's see if we can go back to Maria.
So I turned off my camera with the suggestion that that might help me and Ned with our connections. Can you hear me any better?
Very clearly. So please, you were talking about inclusive concurrent enrollment, or?
Right. And Julia, thank you very much for picking up on that. I really appreciate that. I mean, that is so exciting. And I just want to say that there's a question about some of us talking about autism and intellectual disability, and we apologize, we're not meaning to connect those two. In Massachusetts, we have an initiative in which these two student populations are getting this incredible opportunity. So that's why you're hearing us talking about these two different populations. But great question. I'm glad you pointed that out. One of the things I would say is that we have learned so much about how much students are learning in college that it makes us want to go back. And I think a lot of the transition specialists that I work with say we've got to do more now to better prepare students for this incredible opportunity. We need more opportunities for inclusive secondary ed, which we are still really working on, and also more access to career and vocational and occupational ed classes. So I think that's, you know, a path we are still really working on. So thank you for the opportunity to finish that up.
And then Ned, would you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, a big change that I've learned is being a part of the inclusive enrollment the concurrent enrollment program. Being a part of that and just being able to be as a dual enrollment student through my Westfield public schools, and getting a chance to what's it called? Learn about college, learn what it's like, learn what I can do, and get a feel for it before I, pick a major and go from there. So, and, being able to go to a couple other speeches along the way. So I've learned a lot, and now I'm ready, hopefully by the fall, ready to take those skills elsewhere. So.
Great. This is getting to more technical part of education and autism, and it's a specific question. And what's the most challenging regulation or piece of legislation for students with autism that hampers their educational progress and hampers their access to education, and how and what would you do to change that? Stephen, do you want to start out on that one?
I can't tell if I'm muted or not.
No, you're fine.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, in general, what I see the biggest challenges is the support cliff that occurs after graduation from high school, be it at the standard age of 17 or 18, or all the way up to the edge of the 22nd birthday. If there was legislation in which to continue some of those supports, so that person can engage in higher education, should they be able to, so that person can find fulfilling and productive employment in the voc ed end of things. And then also residential, providing, right-sizing the support, you might say. So some of us on the spectrum may need a lot of support in our adult living, and others of us may just need an hour a day or a few hours a week of support. And if there were ways to provide these, to provide these provisions for support, I think that would be great.
Great. Ned, do you want to weigh in on this one?
Yes, I would like to. In regard to what Stephen was saying, we in our program, some of the supports only last until age 22. And what I've noticed is certain kids need, certain students, I get kids in my mind, but certain students, they need a lot more support depending on, how strong their autism or disability is. But the hard part is some of that, we don't know where to look, or maybe the families don't know where to look, or they're just not available. Like, for example, I'm finishing with an internship, and I was hoping to, get more job experience, but because I'm turned 22, my internship will not let me join in the summer. So I have to look for another way to get a part-time job, and because I'm still not ready for, what I want to do in my career job. So it would be great to see resources available after the age of 22. I'd love to see.
Great. Maria?
Sorry. I totally agree with what Ned and Stephen are saying, that it would be nice to have more supports. And also, I guess what I'm just learning so much about the opportunities that students are getting, and it's led me to get much more interested in how IEPs and how IDEA and WIOA and how this could all be more integrated, so that we have.
Maria, you've continued to break the rules here. You just gave us a whole lot of alphabet, and now you're going to be required to tell the audience on what it is you're talking about.
Boy, jargon buster. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I am very interested in how the individualized education program can be adjusted now to better reflect these great opportunities that students are getting. Because I still see schools really using very traditional forms. I think when the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act is reauthorized, it would be great to see more of these kinds of opportunities now reflected in directing teachers and teams to be looking in this direction, and also to throw in, more community-based transition services. I really think so. I apologize for the jargon. Tom, thank you for busting it.
All right. Julia.
Yeah, we all have a similar theme in terms of this question. I think the cliff that Stephen and others have talked about is one that all individuals with autism face, whether it's at 18 or 22, and it can be a really dramatic cliff without a safety net under it. And I think in terms of the existing laws, I think one of the most exciting and at the same time really challenging parts of existing legislation are what Maria was talking about, the federal special ed law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was strengthened to add a lot more services and planning for transition age youth, age 16 through when they graduate or turn 22, or in some states like Massachusetts, the services start at age 14. And the law is so strong and innovative, but I think around the country, school districts are struggling with how to fully implement its promise in terms of helping special ed departments and school districts figure out how to provide educational opportunities in the community, on the job site, in college campuses, in community recreational settings, so that autism can really generalize and learn the skills they're going to need to be able to succeed, to live independently and have jobs. And so the kind of partnerships that Maria is talking about are envisioned in the law, partnering with rehab, partnering with the developmental disability service agencies. But I think the implementation of the law still needs a lot more work and a lot more collaboration and creative strategies. But it's got huge potential.
Great. One of the things that I'm going to go off script now because I've run out of questions, but you folks here on the panel are the experts, right? So at this point, I guess I would say there's a lot of people that I think the number one group that's in this seminar now are advocates and people who work, it looked like agencies, I think is the way it was described. What advice would you have for them as they go forward in working with people on the spectrum, or in advocating for people on the spectrum, or even sort of in the public realm? What advice, or what would be the best advice that you could give these people? And I know I'm taking you off guard, but
Yes, I'll start.
That's good, Stephen. Thank you.
All right. Well, many things come to mind. And one thing that comes to mind is to presume competence, to presume that the autistic individual understands probably a lot more than they're able to express, or at least express in a way that you're looking for. And we may need to look for alternate means of that expression, and usually that's assistive communication devices. And I've seen that happen so often when people report to me that they're talking about a person on the autism spectrum, say at a team meeting, they happen to be in the room, they're saying some kind of negative things, and suddenly there's all kinds of challenging behaviors that are coming from that person. And that means that they're picking up, they're understanding the situation. So one is presumed competence. Two, the autism spectrum is incredibly wide. And what that suggests is that if you've met one person on the autism spectrum, you've met one person on the autism spectrum. So this huge diversity. And I guess finally, the potential of autistic individuals is unlimited, just like everybody else. It's up to us educators to unlock that potential.
Great. I think those are captions that we should put on as we advertise this recording. Thank you very much. Maria, are you ready to weigh in on advice?
Tom, would you mind just in one sentence, I want to make sure I'm answering this correctly. So could you just repeat?
Well, that's a challenge for me now to remember what I asked. The question really was, we have a lot of advocates and folks who work, I believe that it was phrased, with agencies so I presume they work a lot with folks with autism. So what would be the advice you give them, or the advice you give sort of the broader world about autism?
I guess what's kind of popping into my head is really from both the education perspective and also from the adult services perspective is that I would suggest that we really are imploding and reconstructing what we mean by services and supports. I think we definitely still have, I hate to say it, but I still think there is a medical model that's out there. I think we really
need to describe the medical model.
A more clinical, I'm sorry. Why am I on this panel? I don't know. A more clinical approach to disability. I really love a lot of the comments that I'm seeing in this chat about presuming ability and concepts of universal design. And I think that that's really you know, right now we have an opportunity to really just deconstruct the way we were doing disability services and reconstruct in a way that we're not necessarily looking at disability, but more ability. So I apologize again to everybody for my jargon.
No, it's good. It's good. You're getting into the very technical piece, and it's an opportunity to give more information out in this process. So I appreciate you digging into the weeds. I think it's important that we're there. So, but I want everybody to be clear what we're talking about. Ned, would you have advice for advocates and people that work for agencies and talking about education and people with autism?
For me, it'd just be, you know, education is important either way. And, you know, people on the autism spectrum should be allowed to get as much support as they need to be able to become their dreams. It's just like, I mean, it's just like what I learned at the current job I work. You know, a lot of PBS station shows teach us about how to make a dream, even if we are different than other people. You know, I mean, I'm in college. I got to take some classes that most of the people would think, oh, I wouldn't do. Like, I took a photography class. So a lot of people thought, oh, you're not going to be able to learn any of that stuff. Like, well, I struggled through it, but I got through it. So, in regards, anything is possible. It doesn't have to be a normal person, ordinary person. But I think with autism, they can get there if they use the right supports, if they have the right supports too. So that's my suggestion.
And then another question off script at this point, where maybe you need to be brief and maybe you don't want to be brief when I ask this question. But when you're talking about education and you're talking about people on the spectrum, what advice would you give to people on the spectrum as they are maybe in high school at this point or in college, or what advice would you give to them as they move forward in their educational process?
Ned has a suggestion.
Great, go ahead, Ned.
For anybody who's in high school and college, just, you know, don't stop for anything. You know, you'll have people that wanna tell you can't do things, but we are the only ones that make our dreams. You know, other people may give suggestions, but it's only up to us to make it to prove it to ourselves, not anybody else. We're not here to prove things to people. To ourselves.
That's the next quote that we'll use in advertising this this seminar. Thank you. Julia, it looked like you were ready to jump in there.
Yeah, I think just building on what both Stephen and Ned said, I think the recognizing the potential, the presumed competence, and really what I would say both to the people in the service agencies as well as to the youth with autism or still in school, is to recognize that these really are laws that are civil rights laws. And the reason these civil rights laws that create equal educational opportunities were created is because lawmakers recognize that barriers have to be removed so that the potential of people with autism as well as other disabilities can be untapped. And when the barriers are removed, then that's when people are able to really live their dreams and learn to their potential. And the other thing I'd say to the young adults and youth themselves is that the law really emphasizing having to build on the strengths of students with autism, having to build on their own preferences of what they want to focus on and do and learn. And I think maybe, I don't want to put words in Maria's mouth, but part of what she meant by medical model is that all too often we end up focusing on solely the deficits of what we see so-called deficits of somebody with autism, instead of figuring out how to remove the barriers so that individuals can really learn to their potential and build on their strengths and their interests.
Great. Thank you. Stephen?
Yeah, I think the best thing for us individuals on the autism spectrum to do is to identify our abilities, to identify our strengths, to turn away, and this goes for everybody, to turn away from what I call a model of deficit, disorder, and disability and how we look at autism to an abilities-based model. We need to be asking the question, what can we do? Now, that said, certainly there are challenges to being on the autism spectrum. If there weren't, we wouldn't be here trying to figure it out. However, we need to be looking towards the strengths. Nobody I know has built a career out of remediated weaknesses. And on the flip side of that coin, everybody I know on the autism spectrum who is successful has found a way to parlay their interests and strengths into successful employment.
Thank you. I think we're ready to go to audience questions, and I have one here from Nancy that's a philosophical question that says, if education could be totally redesigned, do the panelists think that autism would still be a disability?
Autism is a disability, but it doesn't have to define us. It doesn't have to define any person. It's just like my autism has come because of the life I went through with family and dealing with argument and, you know, certain circumstances. But that doesn't mean, you know, I have to use that as, you know, not being able to go to work, not being able to do anything. I can still make a dream even if I had an autism disability. You know, I think that's something that some people have, you know, a lot of people our age, you know, people we work with have to look into is, okay, this is what this person has, but what can, like what Stephen said about strengths, you know, we can make a dream or anything if we know our strengths. It's just simple.
Great. Anyone else?
Pretty much echoing what Ned said. Autism is a disability because it significantly impacts our life. But what we also, also as part of autism is what I call a really spiky profile. And what that means is that the things we're good at, we tend to be incredibly good at. The things that we're not so good at, well, they're really, really big challenges. And sometimes there isn't that much in the middle. So if we can catch those spikes to help promote success and also accommodate for those real significant challenges, then we can make fulfilling and productive lives for people on the autism spectrum the rule rather than the exception.
Are you ready for another question, or does anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Go ahead with the question. Another question.
It says, how much do you think that our educational constructs, structure, delivery methods, learning materials, and activities contribute to obstacles to learning for these individuals? Might a society be able to create an educational experience that would render autism as a set of individual learning traits rather than a disability? I believe that may be part of the same question, but does anybody think that want to weigh in on that?
The term universal design comes to mind. And that is if we design curriculum from the get-go to accommodate people with differences and maybe in how we perceive or take in information, be it visually, auditory-wise, musically, kinesthetically, and so on, and also provide diversity in how we can process this information and then demonstrate mastery of material, then we'll be moving towards having one curriculum, you might say, to reach more people.
Anyone else? Here's a maybe more specific question, and it says, what will be the advice that the panelists as experts on autism give to the general public, service providers, and educators about individuals with autism who communicates with a AAC device, which I'm not sure, is that, I don't know what that stands for, augmentative communication or?
Augmentative and assistive communication device.
And it says, in the question goes on, it says, in my experience, many AAC users on the spectrum are considered dumb, not knowing anything, and often not receiving much support that they need to be successful. So I guess it's the question revolves around what advice would you give to professionals and educators about individuals who are using an AAC device?
I don't mind starting here, but others can jump in. Again, the federal laws, both the special ed laws and the Americans with Disabilities Act itself are very clear and strong about the obligation to provide not just the devices that might be needed for people with autism, students with autism who are either nonverbal or have limited oral speech. And as that question points out, it's kind of what we're talking about at the beginning. There can be a lot of myths and stereotypes about the lack of competency and the lack of potential about somebody because they communicate using some kind of assistive technology rather than communicating orally. And so I think the advice I'd give is that it's important that an individual have access to the kind of alternative communication that would enable them to really communicate what they're thinking, help them to learn in a classroom because they have a way to communicate. But the law also talks about the need to provide support and training for the educators and for the non-disabled peers and for the family, because what we find in our own experiences that a family might be successful in obtaining a communication device that could kind of sit gathering dust in the classroom if the educators don't have the support they need to really effectively teach the student how to use the device and to know how to teach somebody who does communicate using alternative means of communication. So I guess what's important is to make sure that whether it's employers, people in the community, teachers, family members, everybody, in addition to the individual with autism, has the support they need so they can really fully communicate and learn and contribute. Because when people are able to communicate, they can really contribute to the whole classroom and the whole community that they're participating in.
Anyone else interested in weighing in on that one?
This is Maria, and I think I would just add that what we try to do from the training perspective, especially with transition specialists, is to always remind people to include those questions about assistive technology, augmentative devices, and general technology in everything you're thinking about a plan for employment and assessing the technology, how technology might enhance that experience or that opportunity. Same with college, same with travel training, same with any kind of community work, and same with education. So I think just always taking that into consideration is a good first step in making sure that you're always thinking about how technology of one kind or another could be assisting or enhancing an opportunity.
Anyone else interested in that? Weighing in on that question? The next question is from Kathy, and it says, why would you have a curriculum for students with autism in an inclusive setting? I think there's a lot in that very simple question. So, and I'm not sure who is interested in jumping in on that one. And I can repeat it if you need it.
Well, there is a lot in that one.
There is.
And I go back to my idea of universal design. And that is if a curriculum is designed for a person with autism, for people with diverse learning styles, and that includes people with other conditions as well, in addition to autism, then we're going to have greater reach with one curriculum, and we'll also be addressing the learning styles of those students who don't have a documented disability and wouldn't be considered to have a disability, but they'll be helped too, because people tend to have preferred styles and methods of learning. And I just saw Glenn type into the chat box, won't they live in an integrated society as an adult? And that's a very good point. And that is integration begins with education in grade school, even preschool.
I guess I just want to get another part of that question that I was, sort of the unspoken part of that question was, what about the question of including students with autism in general education settings? And I'm not sure if that was part of the question or not. And do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, inclusion in general education settings wherever possible. Because the world is not, you might say, a special education school, but it's, for lack of better terminology, it's the world, it's where we live. And the more exposure the person with autism, and by extension people with other differences, can have to the general population in school, the better they'll be able to integrate into society. And flipping it around, the more exposure students who don't have disabilities have to those who have differences, that will make it easier for those individuals to accept people with differences in their community later on as an adult.
I could maybe just jump into, I agree completely with what Stephen's emphasizing. And I think what the special ed laws and the disability discrimination laws give is some tools about how to make it work so that inclusion is really effective and appropriate for the student with autism, as well as, for the whole educational community. I think what we see in our law offices is that all too frequently, the students and families are faced with a kind of a choice, neither of which is really a viable option. That if a student needs some focus on their social skills, or they need some focus on some of their behavioral issues, then the way to provide that kind of instruction is in a pull-out setting. And then when the students are in a pull-out setting, often it's really hard to access the academic curriculum that's really based on those hired expectations. So there are models around the country where students are successfully included. They still get the kind of specialized instruction they need to meet their learning needs that result from autism, but they're also learning to be included with their non-disabled peers. Their non-disabled peers are benefiting from everything that they have to contribute. And that's really what the law contemplates. But it really, in many school districts, requires a reshifting of how special ed is viewed, because special ed is often constructed very separate from the gen ed setting. So it takes some advocacy to make it work successfully, in my experience.
Anyone else want to weigh in? I have another interesting and challenging question. That's another very simple question. Let me just move to that one. Kathy is asking what the panelists think about, and she put in quotation marks, disclosure. Does anybody want to address that one?
Well, there's much to say about that as well. Disclosure has two parts. One is for the autistic individual. And how do you tell an autistic individual that they have autism? And how is it done in a way that, and it should be done in a way that emphasizes the abilities, but at the same time, you have to be realistic about the very real challenges, or why would they have the diagnosis? So I think first is the disclosure to the person on the autism spectrum. I was very lucky in this regard. My parents used the word autism in the house just like any other word. So I don't remember any time when I didn't know that I was autistic. And that certainly helped explain a lot of differences. However, I find that people need to, many people don't learn about having autism that way. So I've developed a 4-step approach, which is helpful in telling people and helping them understand what it means to them to be on the autism spectrum. And then there's the other side. When do you tell somebody else that you're on the autism spectrum? And one rubric you might say that I use is that if the effect of being on the autism spectrum significantly impacts a relationship or a situation, then you may need to consider disclosure. And with disclosure comes advocacy. So here's a very, very simple example that I often use in, say, an office situation or in a restaurant. And that is, you may think that my hat here is a fashion statement. And I guess in some ways it is, and it's always good to support my university, Adelphi University. That's where I teach. But it's really an accommodation, because one thing that autism means to me is that sitting under recessed lighting fixtures or down lights is like looking into a spotlight for many other people. And so what that may mean is that, say I'm going into a restaurant or a business office situation, say a supervisor showing me my desk, I may have to say to that supervisor, you know, I wonder if it's okay if I wear this hat. And the reason why is because these lights hurt my eyes. I have very sensitive eyes. Now, what I did there was known as a partial disclosure. And I only talked about the aspect of autism that significantly impacts the situation. And often a partial disclosure is enough. But for other situations, such as when I'm teaching a college course on diagnosis and intervention in autism, it seems to make a lot more sense to do a full disclosure, because that does have a meaningful impact on my relationship with my students. So in a nutshell, those are my ideas about disclosure.
Great. Anyone else want to? Go ahead, Julia.
I was just going to add, that was really well said, Stephen. And I think we see where for the disclosure to the young person with autism, him or herself, it really comes to a head because the federal special ed law talks about how students are supposed to participate in their own IEP meetings and really become self-advocates in their own IEP meetings, either depending on the state at age 14 or age 16. And so what we've seen a lot of families and educators wrestle with is exactly the point you're talking about. Well, how can they be self-advocates and participating when maybe nobody's really talked to them about the fact that they have autism and what that means and how to address that as positive part of their identity. So we see a lot of folks struggling with that, how to make disclosure appropriate and positive around those ages.
Anyone else on the panel interested in weighing in on the issue of disclosure?
Hello, Tom, this is Ned.
Yep.
In regards to disclosure, I think it all depends on, the person that the person's talking to, or in regards of say if you're in the inclusive program, for those people, it would be good to tell about what their just autism is, so that way they can people can understand how to help them, or how to assist them. I think that's where there's a fine line between, if I tell someone about my autism, are they going to be able to assist me, or is it they're going to make fun of me? So I think it depends on the situation and who the person you're talking to in regards to disclosing.
I now have a simple question. Rosina asks, what age should a child be tested for autism? I don't know if any of you folks have the expertise on that, but anybody want to weigh in on that question?
Well, my immediate response is, well, as soon as possible. As soon as you notice a departure from typical development. So say you have a child who has a lot of difficulty in engaging in social reciprocity at age 18 months. You may not be able to diagnose autism at that point, but maybe you could see if the child is at risk of being on the autism spectrum. From what I know, it's possible to get a reasonably reliable diagnosis from about age 24 months.
And I think increasingly pediatricians and other kinds of professionals are trained themselves and being provided support, as well as information for parents, so that they can know what might or might not be a sign of possible autism. So as Stephen said, the children are diagnosed as soon as possible. And because we do know that when children get the kinds of supports and accommodations and services they need early on, then that really improves their overall learning and to their potential and outcome.
Ned or Maria?
You said me, but he actually had something to say. He thought if he, right, about your parents?
See that, yeah, in regards of the knowing what age, see, the thing is, that was one of the things my parents didn't do, was they didn't, what led to taking so long to get understanding of what, because I had a lot of history and some things I did with my family, and my family didn't treat it like they were supposed to. So that's what led to going, maybe the stuff that I went through, and then finally having to leave my family to where the person getting understood about what I had started to get more supports.
Yeah, you thought that they would have benefited from having you tested earlier,
Yeah.
You said. Yeah. I think we'll leave it at that. Ned wanted to say that.
Right. At this point, we are running out of time. Rebecca, who was our MC, is in Pennsylvania, and I guess the storm got a little rough there, and she lost power during this process. So I'm going to do the wrap up here. Katie Allen is assisting me. She's just jumped in to put on the screen who today's presenters were. It was a great discussion today. I learned a whole lot, and I think we've got a lot of important information that came out today. I want to thank today's presenters, Stephen Shore, a clinical professor at Adelphi University, Julia Landau, who's an attorney, who's the director of the Autism Center at the Massachusetts Advocates for Children, Maria Paiewonsky, who's a transition specialist for Think College, who is here at the Institute for Community Inclusion, and Ned Pavlik, who is a student at Holyoke Community College. And I'm Tom Sanacandro, the director of the Institute of Community Inclusion. And we are celebrating our 50th anniversary, and that's part of why we are having this seminar series. There's a lot more questions that have come up, and where hopefully they can be addressed at some point. This series will be posted online, or this episode will be online as well. I just want to remind you, you can follow the ICI on Facebook and Twitter, and it's a great way to stay up to speed and to know what events like this are coming. You can see our Facebook and Twitter URLs on the slide that's in front of you. The next event in the series will focus on employment, and it's coming up on March 22nd. Watch the website, communityinclusion.org, and our social media for channels and updates. And that's it for today's event. So I want to thank you all for coming. Before you leave today, please navigate to the link on the screen that says Give Feedback. That's very important to us. Let us know what you thought of today's presentation. And again, thank you all for being part of this. And I want a special thanks to Rebecca Lazo and to the crew at ICI who made this rather challenging event happen. It was a tremendous event. Thank you all for being as part of it.
This is Katie. I just want to add the Give Feedback button. We've changed that, so you will get a follow-up email. It will come tomorrow to everyone who is registered. In that email, you'll have a link. This link will be for an evaluation for today's webinar. And after completing that evaluation, if you are eligible to receive certified rehabilitation credits, you can receive those after taking the evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you, everybody. It was a great presentation today.